Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. So today our LEAP lecture is by SAVANNAH FERRETTI. SAVANNAH is a fifth-year PhD candidate in Earth System Science at the University of California, Irvine. She's co-advised by professors Mike Pritchard, now at NVIDIA, and Jane Baldwin. Her research combines statistical modeling and machine learning to understand the drivers of South Asian monsoon rainfall. She is passionate about building reproducible open source workflows that bridge atmospheric science and data science, and she is currently exploring opportunities for the next stage of her career after completing her PhD. Okay, take it away, SAVANNAH.
Okay, hi everybody. I don't know if you can see me. Can you see me?
No, well, we can see. Okay,
Okay,
now,
what about
yes.
now? Awesome. Okay. Hi everybody. Thank you, Caitlin, for introducing me, and thank you to the staff at LEAP for setting this up, especially Molly and Catherine. Your work does not go unnoticed. So today I'm just going to be talking about some work that has come together in the last few months. For those of you who know that I have not spent a lot of time doing machine learning, and this kind of space is pretty new to me in terms of my own research. And so this work I've done in the last few months is a culmination with past and present members of LEAP, including Jerry Lin, who's now at Boston University, Sarah Shemek, who's at NYU, Mike Pritchard, who's at NVIDIA now, and Tom Bugler, who was working with Mike when he was at UCI. So the title of this talk is Making Data-Driven Climate Prediction Interpretable by Design. Oh, I think I can move forward here. There we go. Okay, so I want to start with the idea that climate prediction is fundamentally non-local. You can imagine we're trying to predict a scalar quantity y at one location and one time, which we'll denote with x naught, t naught. So that value of y doesn't depend only on the conditions at that exact point in space and time. Instead, it depends on conditions in surrounding horizontal locations, throughout the vertical column, and in the recent past. So if a model is going to be accurate, it must be able to represent this non-local information. And existing data-driven models can learn this non-local structure. A common way they do this is through operator learning, where the model maps high-dimensional predictor fields, which we call here as phi indexed by the letter I, that can vary in space, height, which is represented by pressure, and time, and they map them directly to local outputs. And this is the idea behind models like ForecastNet and ACE2, which achieve strong predictive skill across a range of different weather phenomena. And that's mainly because they can combine information across space, height, and time in really complex ways. But in these models, non-local structure is encoded implicitly. And what I mean by that is that the relationships the model learns are buried inside really, really large parameter sets, so the model is essentially a black box. And as we add more non-local context to the model can become more complex, and it's not really any clearer what it's actually using to make predictions, like which vertical levels matter most, what spatial context matters, or what memory timescales matter. So the question really is, how do we make non-local influence directly visible inside the operator? And we can do this by separating the operator into two parts: non-local aggregation and local prediction. In this non-local aggregation step, the model is gathering information from the surrounding non-local context, and it's compressing it into a small set of features, which is denoted here by phi hat. And this is the step where the model decides what parts of horizontal space, height, and time are actually meaningful. Then in the local prediction step, a simple neural network can map those features to the local output. So separating these two steps keeps the prediction mapping much simpler, and it makes the model's use of this non-local information a lot easier to interpret. So next I'm going to go a bit more into detail about how this non-local aggregation step works. And so we're going to do this by looking at an example, and we're going to walk through a simple example, which is the compression of a vertical profile. So you can imagine that we have a single predictor field, like relative humidity, that is sampled through the atmospheric column at a fixed location and time, so we can plot it just as a function of pressure, so phi of p. The goal is to turn this profile into a singular feature that we can pass onto the prediction step while still keeping the vertical influence directly visible. And a natural first idea to do this compression is to just integrate the profile over the atmospheric column, and then we can use that as the compressed feature. And this works computationally because it takes a high-dimensional predictor with one value at every pressure level and collapses it into a single number, but it also forces every pressure level to be treated the same way. A value at one level contributes just as much as a value at any other level, and once we collapse the entire profile into this one number, we lose information about where that number is coming from. So we can't tell whether the feature is mostly determined by the lower levels or the mid levels or somewhere else in the atmospheric column. So that leads us to a question that we came about, specifically me and Tom, which is what if we could treat each pressure level differently? And that's exactly what this integration kernel framework that we came up with allows us to do. So a kernel integrated feature just assigns different importance to different pressure levels. So instead of treating the atmospheric column uniformly, we introduce a kernel, put here in yellow, called K of P, which is a set of learned weights that we can apply over the profile. And here's just a visual of what K of P could look like. If K of P has large absolute magnitude, the pressure level has stronger influence on the compressed feature. If K of P is near 0 or near this dotted line here, that level has very little influence on the compressed feature. And importantly, the kernel weights can be positive or negative, so different pressure levels can influence the feature in opposite directions. So the key idea here is that this non-local aggregation step is still doing a form of dimensionality reduction, but now it's doing it in a way that keeps the vertical influence interpretable. So instead of collapsing everything into a single uniform average, we learn a sort of weighting pattern that shows the parts of the column that matter for the compressed feature and thus for generating the prediction. And because that weighting pattern is explicit, we can analyze it directly to understand how the model is using this vertical structure. And so this kernel integration idea extends across horizontal space, height, and time. In the example that we just walked through, the non-local domain was only the atmospheric column, so the kernel told us which pressure levels mattered most, but you can apply this same idea in any of the other dimensions. So you can learn spatial kernels that summarize information across surrounding horizontal grid cells, and temporal kernels that summarize information from recent past time steps. And you don't have to choose just one of these dimensions at a time. You can theoretically apply the kernels in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions. So you can apply it to horizontal space and height, or you can apply it to height and time, or you can apply it to all 3 at once, depending on how much you want to compress the feature. And so you can also give a kernel to each predictor field individually. So each of them learns its own kernels, and we can see what non-local context matters for each variable individually. As you can assume, like for relative humidity, the pressure levels that matter most might not be the same as temperature, for example. And so it's important to be able to represent those differences. So this framework is really, really flexible and allows a bunch of different applications, although I just showed it in a simple vertical example here. But now that we've kind of walked through the structure, I'm going to switch gears and talk about how we can apply this to a real prediction problem. So we're going to use the South Asian monsoon and rainfall here as a test bed for both practical and scientific reasons. Like Caitlin said, this is a region where I've do a lot of my research, and so I've previously examined the drivers of rainfall variability here. In this work, I tested a buoyancy-based diagnostic for predicting month-to-month rainfall changes over the South Asian monsoon domain, and the predictive skill of this diagnostic we found varied a lot across space and time, and that's because this diagnostic relied only on local thermodynamic information, and so that kind of raised the question for us of whether rainfall here depends on non-local structure that local diagnostics cannot capture. And the second reason being that seasonal rainfall in this region has just generally major societal impacts. 80% of the rainfall over the Indian Peninsula comes from the monsoon specifically, and it's really important for rain-fed agriculture here, which drives the local economy. But climate models really struggle to simulate this rainfall. So here I'm just showing the 2000 to 2010 June, July, August, so summertime mean precipitation climatology from iMerge version 6, which is just a satellite-derived product. On the left here is the CMIP6 multi-model mean precipitation for the same 2000 to 2010 period, averaged across 34 different climate models. And here on the right is the model mean bias, where warm colors indicate a dry bias and cool colors a wet bias of the model mean. And so the key point here is that these biases are large, they're spatially coherent, and because of that, we think that the models are missing processes that organize convection and rainfall in this region specifically. So kind of taken together, this makes the South Asian monsoon a natural place to test like interpretable non-local prediction directly. So now we're going to switch to how we set up the prediction problem, introducing the same graphic from earlier. And so we're going to predict hourly precipitation over the South Asian monsoon region shown in this map from June through August at individual grid points and times. And the inputs include a small set of thermodynamic predictors, equivalent relative humidity, equivalent potential temperature, and saturated equivalent potential temperature, plus a small set of local inputs, which are latent heat flux, sensible heat flux, and land fraction. And so each of these local inputs is only available at the same grid cell and time step that we're trying to make the prediction, so they don't have to go through this kernel integration step. All of these predictors are derived from hourly ERA5 data, and the precipitation targets come from iMerge version 6, and it's aggregated to hourly because it's natively half-hourly data. And before training, we regrid both data sets to a common 1 degree by 1 degree grid, which is shown here in the map. You can kind of see how the size of those pixels overlays on this region. And we do this because this kind of matches the horizontal scales at which precipitation is typically parameterized in large-scale models. So the prediction step here just uses a really simple feed-forward neural network that has 4 hidden layers. It has GALU activation in between those layers, as well as dropout in between those layers. And we keep this network intentionally lightweight so that the performance that we get from different models, which we'll talk about in a little bit, reflects how these inputs are represented and not some sort of architectural complexity. And so training uses Atom optimizer, and we're optimizing for mean squared error. And we use a chronological data split here. So we use all of our hourly data from 2000 to 2014 for training. We use 2015 to 2017 for validation, and then 2018 to 2020 for testing. And so this results, as you can imagine, in a ton of samples. We have 18 million samples for training alone, and then over 3 million samples each for validation and testing. So next, we need to prescribe exactly what non-local context means to the model. And so you can kind of say that some of these choices, are up to the user, and the way that I made the code available means that people who try to use this framework can change what the non-local context actually is for their specific prediction problem. And so for a prediction at any given location, we can say that non-locality is dependent on the horizontal, vertical, and temporal extent of information that the model is allowed to access. And so horizontally, we say that this corresponds to a 3x3 neighborhood of adjacent grid cells centered on X0. Vertically, it corresponds to 16 pressure levels from 1,000 to 500 hectopascals, where this is just all of the pressure levels that's available for ERA5 for the specific layer of the atmosphere. And then temporally, it corresponds to the current time step together with the previous 6 time steps. And so we can also say that if a model is local along a given dimension, it only sees information at the current grid cell, X0, the lowest pressure level above the surface, P0, and then at the current time step, T0. So now we're going to kind of talk about our results, and I explain as we go. And we can actually test which form of non-local context actually improves precipitation prediction in this region, which is kind of an interesting first step towards better understanding how non-local structure matters here. And so we're going to do that by keeping everything fixed in our kind of modeling pipeline, except for what non-local context the model can access. And then we're going to see how predictive skill, which we measure here by R squared, on the test set changes. So first, we can look at a fully local model, which the notation here is x naught, p naught, t naught for that fully local model. And we have an R squared of 0.413. And again, this model is fully local, so it's only using information from the same grid cell, the same time step, and from the lowest pressure level above the surface for the given predictor fields to make the prediction at x naught, t naught. As expected, the predictive skill here is pretty low. But here we can look at the total opposite end of the spectrum, which is the fully non-local model. So it's allowed to see that 3x3 horizontal neighborhood, all of those pressure levels available from 1,000 to 500 hectopascals, and the current plus 6 previous time steps. And this model produces much higher skill. And so together, these two cases kind of define the range of predictive performance that we're going to expect to see for this type of simple model. And so to understand what sources of non-local information are responsible for this skill gain between the fully local and the fully non-local model, we can introduce non-locality kind of one dimension at a time and do a sort of sensitivity test here. So if only the time dimension is non-local, we could see that there's a pretty small improvement in skill here. So that kind of tells us that adding temporal memory for this model doesn't really add much value in terms of performance. If we add just non-locality in horizontal space, we again see little improvements. That tells us that the model doesn't really get much more skill if we only have non-locality in space. But when the model is only non-local in the vertical, we can see that there's a big improvement in skill. So that tells us that the largest performance gain comes from letting the model see quote unquote vertical structure. And this result isn't totally surprising to us. It aligns with our understanding that vertical thermodynamic structure plays a dominant role in controlling precipitation at these scales. But the agreement from our results kind of gives us confidence that the models are capturing physically meaningful sources of skill here. And it motivates why we focus next on looking at models that use kernel integration only in the vertical dimension. So we're going to compare our model with the full vertical context, which is this second bar from the right here, to one that uses kernel integrated features, so that framework that we talked about earlier. So again, up to this point, this vertically non-local model has access to the full vertical profiles for each predictor field, so it can use information from all 16 pressure levels directly, and that gives us pretty strong predictive skill, but it still leaves this vertical influence difficult to interpret. So black boxy, kind of like we talked about earlier. So the key question that we wanted to answer here was, can we compress the vertical structure into small interpretable set of features and still retain similar skill to this vertically non-local model? And so this yellow bar here shows the kernel model, which is conceptually the same kernel integration idea that we saw earlier in the vertical profile example. And so for each predictor field, again, we're learning a vertically varying kernel, K of P, and we use that kernel to compress the full vertical profile into a small number of features that we pass into the same neural network that we use in all of these blue baseline models. And in terms of performance, the non-parametric kernel model achieves skill close to this vertically non-local model. And so that's telling us that it's retaining most of the benefit of vertical non-locality, but now in a form where all of the information is compressed into a lower dimensional feature and in a form where we can directly analyze what vertical information the operator for this model is exactly using. And so we have another level of comparison here where we're going to now compare this non-parametric kernel model to an even more structured parametric versions. And so the vertical profile of weights from this non-parametric kernel model, this yellow model here, can learn essentially any shape of the data. We're not constraining how the model is allowed to learn. But we wanted to ask, what if we constrained the shape that the kernel is allowed to learn to something simple and way more familiar? So the remaining bars that I'm going to show here in this blank white space are going to show parametric kernel models where the kernel is restricted to shapes like a top hat average, exponential decay either from the surface or from the top of our column, of just a Gaussian with a simple center and width that's learned, multiple Gaussians where you're allowed to learn two centers and two different widths to represent two different modes of variability here, and this kind of mixed hat kernel where like different predictor fields are allowed to learn different parametric forms. So we can have relative humidity and saturated equivalent potential temperature learn mixed Gaussians, for example, but equivalent potential temperature is going to learn the exponential. So we're allowed to mix and match what predictor fields learn which types of parametric kernels just based on the non-parametric shapes that we'll analyze later. And so these constraints here kind of make the kernels more structured and interpretable, and it also reduces the number of parameters, but we're seeing that performance-wise, these parametric models retain nearly the same skill as the non-parametric kernel model. So all of these red bars are pretty similar to each other and pretty similar to this yellow bar. So even with a highly restricted, fully interpretable representation of this like vertical non-local aggregation step that we talked about earlier, we're still capturing most of the predictive value of vertical non-locality. And so that kind of suggests to us that much of the useful vertical information for these models can be summarized through a small number of simple, physically meaningful structures, and that the choice of parametric form doesn't really impact your results very much. And so now we're going to directly look at what these vertical kernels learned for these yellow and red models. And here's just a reminder of that image we talked about earlier of what the kernel can actually look like. We're plotting the kernel as a function of pressure with a zero line, and the kernel is allowed to be positive or negative. So these kernels again show different parts of how the column contributes to these integrated features used to predict precipitation, and it tells us again whether that contribution is positive or negative. So we're going to start with the non-parametric kernels here. So the kernels learned by that yellow bar on the previous plot. And so again, we learn a different kernel for each of our predictor fields here. So this side is RH, this is for equivalent potential temperature, and then this is for saturated equivalent potential temperature. And again, we could see that these learned kernels vertically vary for each of these predictor fields. And this black line here is just going to be the zero line. So it just occurs at different places for each of these for simplicity. So what stands out just like immediately is that there's like some clear predictor specific structure going on. All of these lines don't look the same. So that tells us that the model is saying that different pressure levels matter differently for different predictors, which is kind of a hunch we had, but didn't know if that would actually show up in the results. So it's cool to see. So we can look at the fact that relative humidity here, if we look like one by one, emphasizes both this like near surface layer and the lower free troposphere with kind of no importance assigned to anything in between. And that's pretty consistent with what we physically expect for South Asian monsoon convection, where like the boundary layer, moisture, and free tropospheric humidity kind of set rainfall intensity here. And then for equivalent potential temperature, it shows like mostly positive weighting over the lower troposphere boundary layer area with kind of like a localized negative contribution here at 600 hectopascals. And so that kind of tells us that there's sensitivity in the model to contrast between boundary layer conditions and conditions aloft. And for saturated equivalent potential temperature, we kind of get this weird alternating structure back and forth across this zero line. And so this one was a little kind of harder to interpret. I had to do some more digging into the literature to see if this like physically made sense. And it kind of did. So there's like stability and entrainment that controls whether buoyancy is sustained during ascent, but saturated equivalent potential temperature really becomes more important in this lower tropospheric layer, lower free tropospheric layer of the lower troposphere, and less important in the boundary layer. And we kind of see that with like these larger absolute values of the kernel here in this layer. So even with just like letting the kernels learn kind of whatever structure they want, so like not imposing any structure, they kind of recover some physically meaningful vertical controls on precipitation. And so now we're going to compare this to a more structured parametric representation which is shown here on this bottom row, which uses our best performing non-parametric model. And I know that there's a lot of lines and colors, and I'm going to explain what each of these is. And so this is an example of the model that allows different functional forms for each predictor. So for relative humidity here on the left and saturated equivalent potential temperature here on the right, we're allowing the parametric form for these two predictor fields to be what we call a mixture of Gaussians, where the kernel has to learn a center and a width for two different Gaussian modes here. And so the center is not restricted to be like anywhere in the middle. It can be like at, boundaries of our column, which is why you kind of get like this weird exponential shape here. And so the two components for this mixture of Gaussians are like in the dotted blue and dashed blue, and then the sum of those is what this red line is plotted here. And so again, we're learning this mixture of Gaussians for relative humidity and for saturated equivalent potential temperature. It's a little bit easier to see here the two different modes. You have like one mode that's long like this and another mode that's localized like this, and then the sum of them gives you this red line. But for equivalent potential temperature, we learn just exponential decay. So we're allowing the models to determine the scale of decay and then also whether we should be decaying from this top bound of our kind of like partial column or the surface. So there's two things that the model is learning here. And so in terms of complexity, these free-form non-parametric kernels are learning a different weight for every pressure level here. So there's 16 points on this of inflection on these lines, where for these parametric kernels, there's way less. For the mixture of Gaussians has the most, and there's 4 because it's learning 2 centers and 2 widths. Exponential decay is only learning 2 parameters, whether it decays from the surface or from the top of our partial column, and the decay scale. So we're simplifying again what the kernels are allowed to learn even more, and so that's making the compressed features even simpler. And we're kind of getting rid of a little bit of this noise that we're seeing up here on the top with these non-parametric kernels. And so this learned structure that we're getting here on the bottom is pretty physically intuitive when you compare it to the kernels on the top here. And so relative humidity is assigning importance near the surface and aloft, just like this kernel is, but in kind of a more interpretable shape here. We're seeing exponential decay from the surface here for equivalent potential temperature. So that's kind of representing this boundary layer importance. And when you kind of force it to learn a simple structure, you don't even get this localized contribution here. And when we assign, again, mixture of Gaussians to saturated equivalent potential temperature, we learn 2 modes, kind of almost like a Gaussian that looks representative of an exponential decay that represents kind of this boundary layer importance, and then another Gaussian that shows us importance in the lower free troposphere here. And so the sum of that kind of represents both of those impacts on the learned kernel. And so now I'm kind of come to the end, and I'll kind of end with 3 main takeaways here. The first is that non-local structure is essential, but usually implicit. Many climate processes depend on non-local structure and horizontal space, height, and time. And yet a lot of operator learning approaches kind of encode these influences in really opaque and hard to disentangle ways. Second is that integration kernels, this framework kind of makes non-local influence explicit and interpretable. So by separating how non-local information is aggregated from how the actual prediction is made, we can see the physically important weighting patterns and compare them directly with predictive scales. So that kind of just gives us a little more insight into this black box problem that like maybe post hoc explainability methods or kind of latent representations like encoder decoder models kind of can't give us. And so third, these interpretable kernel features enable physics discovery from the data. And what I mean by that is because this kernel integration provides like an interpretable form of dimensionality reduction, it's really useful for tools like symbolic regression, which is used for equation discovery, which like kind of have a requirement of low dimensional physically meaningful inputs. And that's kind of what motivated this project kind of coming about, is that I'm planning to use these kernel integrated features in order to do some equation discovery for this specific region. And that's what the last chapter of my PhD will be about. So stay tuned for that. So with that, I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in today, virtually and in person. And here is my contact information. You can contact me via email or find me on Blue Sky or on GitHub. And then this is a QR code to the project repo if you're interested in looking through this code. It's publicly available as of right now. So thank you guys again so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, so I'm going to ask a question. Thank you, Savannah. It was a very beautiful presentation and very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I had a couple questions. Okay, maybe one. So I'm understanding there's some kind of trade-off between performance and interpretability here.
Mhm.
And among the kernel methods, there's a trade-off between like the fully non-parametric kernel that has the best performance but is not interpretable and is of higher dimension, and the parametric ones which are smaller and more smooth. My first question was, maybe I didn't catch it, but how do you motivate the choice of the kernels? Because in those examples you showed by Gaussian kernel and
Mhm.
an exponentially vanishing kernel. Why
Yes.
those? Why not others? Does it depend on the field that you're modeling?
Yeah, so
Your
I think
intuition?
we kind of did a lot of trial and error with which parametric forms we were going to use. Our goal was kind of to test a few, see how they perform, and then when we choose different ones for specific predictor fields, they were kind of going to be motivated by based on like what the non-parametric kernel showed. So like
Okay.
here is the results for all of them, which I just thought was maybe a little too overwhelming to show on the
Maybe.
one slide. But like what we did was we first kind of looked at these shapes to kind of motivate what kind of shapes might be useful. So like the easiest one to interpret here was kind of the top hat. Like a level is basically not important or it is important, but that performed the worst
Okay.
out of our parametric models. So
Okay.
we tried to get a little more complicated as we went. So then we said, okay, maybe an exponential, maybe a Gaussian, and then Sarah was like, maybe a mixture of Gaussians.
Mm.
And then what I eventually did was I tested every possible combination of these different types of kernels in this kind of mix model to see what combination gave us the highest performance. And that just ended up being a mixture of Gaussian for
Okay.
relative humidity and equivalent potential temperature, and then an exponential for equivalent potential temperature.
Okay. And so those kernels are parameters shared across the horizontal columns, or it's one per
Yes.
column? They're
Yes.
shared.
Yes. So it's shared across all the columns. So we're trying
Okay.
to not learn like specific vertical importance for specific columns. We're trying to learn a forest representation. And we like tested the uncertainty of this a little bit. Like we ran the models for three different random seeds just to see like what the spread on this would be. And the spread in R squared, like the error bars, I didn't even put them on the plot because like it was like less than 10 to the negative 3 standard deviation. And there was like a little bit of spread on the non-parametric kernels, which makes sense, right? Because we're not imposing a functional form. They're allowed to learn
Of
any
course.
shapes. So you can assume that there might be different crazy looking shapes that get us the same R
Yeah.
squared. Those might be
Basically
a little bit.
overfitting. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You can like overfit a little bit. We didn't find it totally in this work. I know Tom had done a little bit looking into this and they found like a little bit more spread than I found in my work, but I'm also working over a smaller region and I'm working with a smaller region, but like a lot more samples. So we're kind of really forcing it to decide on something. But in these parametric forms, you really don't get any underdetermination of what the kernel should look
Hmm.
like. It basically learns the same thing every time. So yeah, like you said, there is a trade-off between interpretability and skill. You just hope that like depending on the process you're trying to represent, like you have to weigh whether you want to understand what's going on or whether you want to have better performance. And like if you kind of aren't sure where to go with that, this kind of allows you to test the limits of both per se. And you said you had another question,
No,
Matthew?
maybe I'm gonna stop there.
Okay.
So thank you very much and really great presentation, honestly.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yang, would you like to read your
Yeah,
question
yeah,
yourself?
yeah, I'll try because there's construction work. So thank you for the great presentation. I was wondering the kernels projects to one quantities or it could be several. And in
Mhm.
the kernel in the third and second row, what does a negative value means? It feels like it's just a magnitude. So to me, it reads like they have to be correlated with the negative. So thanks.
Yeah, those are both good questions. So the kernel, like when you're doing this kernel integration if you're trying to make a prediction at a specific point in space and time and you want to compress only over the vertical, then you learn a scalar quantity, you get a kernel integrated feature just for that specific point in space and time. But then you can imagine you have like a feature vector with a bunch of these kernel integrated quantities at all the different points in space and time that you're trying to make the prediction at. So like you're learning a bunch of different, like you're integrating over all these points in space and time, but we're forcing the network to learn one representation of like a learned weighting patterns that it can kind of be applied or generalized to all the points in space and time where we're making the prediction. And then to get to your second question, you're right in that like the negative values of the kernel weight mean negative contribution and positive values mean positive contribution. But like what that means for the kernel integrated feature is that like, say you have a value of 5 for this kernel integrated feature, the levels where the weights are negative when you do the integral will decrease that number. And the levels where the contribution is positive will increase that number. So it just changes the overall value of the kernel integrated feature. And we allow it to be negative or positive because we don't want to assume that certain levels either won't increase the feature value at all or will only increase it positively, which is like what you would get if you force the kernels to only be positive. And we wanted to account for the fact that like maybe certain pressure levels are decreasing the value because some things are negatively correlated. So does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great talk, Savannah. I'm wondering, when you were discussing like all the different possible predictors, like, did you look at like a full 4D vector? What I understood is that you just look at the spatial features on the surface and the time features just at that point. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, so kind of what these features are, like in the paper, we kind of write it for more machine learners. So we represent these like as three-dimensional predictor fields, but really like relative humidity, equivalent potential temperature, and saturated equivalent potential temperature vary with latitude, longitude, time, and height. So they're 4D predictors, but like for this specific problem, after we determined that vertical local structure matters the most, we only do this like kernel integration over the vertical dimension. So like we are basically flattening the vertical profile at every point in space and time for each one of these predictors, and then passing that to the network instead of just like the full profile of each of those variables being passed to the network. Did that make sense?
yeah, but I guess I'm wondering if when you're showing the different tests, is the
Mhm.
full non-local test, do you have 4D information or you just
Oh,
have,
yeah.
okay.
Okay, yeah. So we do have 4D information for the fully non-local test. So like it can see like a horizontal neighborhood around the grid point we're trying to make the prediction at. So it can see again, basically like a radius of surrounding horizontal grid cells. And then it can also see the full vertical column that we're working with, so 1,500 hectopascals. And then it also sees not just the current time step where you're making the prediction, but 6 previous. So like we're basically bounding the performance scale here by saying, what if we can only see local stuff? What if we can see local non-locality within some sort of specified domain, because we can't pass like all previous time steps or like all surrounding neighborhoods. It would take too long to run all these models multiple times.
Okay,
I
that's
get
what I
like,
was trying to
yeah,
ask.
okay.
So for the memory, you don't look at the memory of the full 3D
Yeah,
space.
we're
Okay.
constraining it to be like a set window basically for each one. So it's almost like a moving window given depending on like when you're actually doing the prediction.
Just a last one, Savannah. Did you try Fourier features like, say, a few Fourier mods that you can parameterize to try to learn this kind of shapes, as opposed to Gaussians or exponential kernels?
No, we didn't. The way I guess I presented it and presenting this in a way to like it's more so a framework that can be pretty adaptable. So like we use these like pretty simple parametric functions as examples of different types of modes that you can learn, but theoretically you can build modes that differ in complexity and shape and try to apply them in the same way. The benefit of this is like you have that flexibility of like what those parametric functions may be down the line if you want to like use different ones, and you can kind of just like plug and chug to this pipeline once you decide what other functions you may be in, because that depends on your data, right? Like you might
Of
have
course.
data that gives you a non-parametric function that looks nothing like the parametric functional forms that we use. And so
Mm.
then none of those would work and you would need to find
Yeah.
another alternative. But the idea is that you can.
Yeah, because those oscillations look like hard to mimic with a kernel, so yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, we tried like sine and cosine kernels as well, and they ended up just learning what looked like Gaussian. So
Oh, okay, okay.
we kind of scrapped that idea, but like you can test, I guess, like a bunch of different types of functions. It also like depends on how complex you want that learned shape to be.
Okay.
But yeah, so we tested a few things. This is kind of what we settled on for the paper, but yeah, you have a lot of flexibility in that aspect.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
It was a great talk. Thank you. I enjoyed it. So my question is about the size of the spatial domain, the window that you used.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious, like how important is the spatial extent? Because there are a number of works that shows the spatial distribution of is significant for the precipitation. But I think in your work you showed the vertical profile is a dominant one. Is it sensitive to the choice of the windows that you use for the spatial? Can you
Yeah,
explain that?
that's a good question. We didn't really have the time because this was a project with a crazy like 3 month timeline to test the sensitivity to different domain sizes in the horizontal space and in the vertical and in time. So like for the vertical, we use the full column available to 500, and that was like an intentional choice because above 500 you can kind of have like causality of issues with rainfall that like we didn't want to represent, or like kind of would make the physical interpretation a little more difficult. So we decided to cap it at 500 because below that we're really representing deep convection and the lower free tropospheric processes, and that would be enough. But we didn't test any sensitivity to like how big the like horizontal neighborhood could be or how many past time steps you could use just because of time. But I could totally imagine that if you like change that domain size, especially if your data is at different resolution than mine was, that it would impact the results. And so this kind of like sensitivity test of like what non-local structure matters more, like doing that before you actually do the kernel integration, I thought was a useful process because it kind of tells you where to focus your energy. And so like for us, it wasn't worth focusing our energy with temporal or horizontal kernels, and it was really worth it in the vertical, but like that might not be the same depending on the data and prediction problem that you use. So yeah, the choices are kind of arbitrary. You could definitely like test the limits of those bounds, but it also depends on how long you want these models to take to run.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Savannah. Nice talk.
Thanks, Greg.
I had more of a conceptual question about sort of the coupled relationship between, the environment and convection. So you have some sort of buoyancy profile or moisture, and it affects deep convection. And then the deep convection starts, and it modifies that profile pretty rapidly within like the course of minutes to hours. So you have, buoyancy leaving, and you have a cooling lower, PBL. And so when you sort of look at all the profiles matched with convection, they're already influenced by the convection itself,
Yes.
which makes the prediction problem, hard, right? Because you couldn't use that profile in a model because, as a predictor for the convection, because it was already kind of the result of convection. So how do you view, how did you think about that? And was that wrapped into how you were approaching things?
That is a good question. And I don't know if we thought about it as explicitly as you just laid it out for us. I think the way that like I had approached this problem, or like the way that this project kind of came about, was like Tom Buechler had this idea and he needed somebody to apply the problem. And like the previous work that I had done in my PhD focused on using this like buoyancy diagnostic where like the main drivers of buoyancy are like how much like undilute buoyancy you have in the boundary layer versus how much like entrainment of dry area you get in the lower troposphere, and like kind of averaging even those two processes together into like one term that doesn't have any horizontal structure kind of just gives a scale. So that kind of motivated why we worked on this problem and why we chose the predictor fields that we chose. But yeah, I don't think we, like you said, I don't think we've spent enough time kind of analyzing how like these learned kernels and like the profiles of them might be a reflection of like, I guess like chicken or egg, like cause and effect of what the convection actually does to the profile. And so that I think could use like more thought for sure. Yeah, that would be interesting to like think through.
Thanks.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Savannah, thank you so much for joining us and presenting to us today.
Thank you.